One of the most haunting images of the Second World War was child soldiers armed with weapons such as Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, Panzerschreck rocket launchers, and MP40s. The situation in the final days of the war in Germany was so desperate that children who were barely 10 years old were thrust in the way of Soviet T-34 tanks, artillery crews, and the brutality of the Red Army. What happened inside the German capital of Berlin in April 1945 was savage and shocking, and the 1,000-year Reich was collapsing in just 12 years. The Allied armies were pushing in from the west and the Soviet Red Army from the east, and the Nazis began to rely on boys, some not even teenagers, to stand in the face of conquer. These were members of the Hitler Youth, and their involvement came from complete desperation. This is the dark reason why child soldiers were used and were ultimately shot by the enemy. For many years, as soon as the Nazis came into power, they began to indoctrinate young boys and girls into their politics and ideas. The Hitler Youth wasn't just a youth club that children would attend and play games on a Friday night after school. It was a ruthless military training organisation. The boys were prepared to become soldiers who would one day give their life for the Reich. The German boys were taught many things, including that war was heroic, that sacrifice for the fatherland was glorious, and dying for Hitler was one of the most honourable things that someone could do. They were also taught many other disturbing things, such as the persecuting policies of the Nazis, and that Aryan people were racially superior, but also that the enemy, in particular communists, and the Soviets were barbaric, threatening, and not worthy of life. By 1945, an entire generation of young people had grown up under Nazi education and brainwashing, and many teenagers firmly believed in the ideals of the regime. Some did lose faith, but not many. So because of this ideology and belief, the young men of Nazi Germany didn't need too much convincing to take up arms and then fight. By 1944, Germany and the Wehrmacht, as well as the military wing of the SS, had lost a huge amount of fighting-aged men and soldiers. After the launchings and failings of the Eastern Front offensives, millions of German soldiers and Axis forces were killed, and millions more were wounded and were captured, becoming prisoners of war. Entire divisions had been destroyed and wiped out, and some were rotting inside Soviet gulags and prisons. Germany, in particular, did not have enough adult soldiers left. Men were being dragged from working in the concentration camps to be then sent to the front lines, and boys aged between 12 and 17 were some of the only remaining groups physically able to hold a rifle and a weapon. Units such as the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, comprising of mostly 16 and 17-year-olds, were formed. These were paired with older SS soldiers and were given mentors, and they were then sent to the front lines. And teenagers were seen in the defence of Normandy in 1944 and also in the Battle of Berlin in 1945. Hitler also believed that younger people of the Reich were more fanatical. He had a distrust of older men who had experienced life before the Nazis came to power and who may have been more dissenting. For him, the youngsters who had been involved and surrounded by the Nazi ideas constantly were more impressionable and less likely to surrender. He also believed they were stronger too, and many through their brainwashing lacked fear. They were sometimes easy to command and control too, and reports of desertion may have been lower in units that used teenage soldiers. Hitler once said, and I quote, "We will create a youth before whom the world will tremble." But by 1945, that belief turned into policy, and teenagers and even younger children became the last lines of defence against the complete destruction of the Nazi Reich. But Nazi propaganda also made the war seem like a final existential battle, and with this, young people believed that they were fighting for their future, and that a life would not be worth living in the event of a German loss. As Soviet forces approached Germany, propaganda from the ministry headed up by Joseph Goebbels told that, if Germany lost, then the entire German people would be destroyed, and also that the Soviets would murder, torture and enslave them. This was exaggerated, but it invoked and inspired a huge amount of fear. Many Germans had heard about or witnessed retaliatory and revenge violence from the Eastern Front, and some young people were told that they were going to be defending their homes, families, and nation itself, which was putting a huge amount of pressure on them. In October 1944, the German government created the Volkssturm, a last-ditch panic militia made up of teenage boys, old men and war veterans who were unfit for normal service. Some of these men were elderly and in their 80s, but others were incredibly young. They were rushed into battle and had minimal training. There are images showing youngsters being given one-shot Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, and the training they were given was just like, well, here you go, aim and the rocket comes out of that way. They were sent in against the Soviet tanks, including heavy tanks. The weapons were also very outdated and poor, and there was a lack of ammunition in the final weeks of the war, meaning that resistance was practically futile. There was also little understanding of real combat within young fighters, and many Volkssturm units actually dissolved straight away as the Soviets appeared, or surrendered very quickly, but some fought hard, particularly in the defence of Berlin. There are very famous images out there showing Hitler awarding medals and accolades to children wearing German uniforms who were fighting in the capital. But for the children, refusing to serve and fight for the defence of the Reich was actually very dangerous. If they did not want to take up arms, then their families could be punished, arrested, and some could even be shot for this. Refusal to fight was considered treason, and in Berlin in particular, there were deserters and refusers who were hung up from lampposts and streetlights with signs around their necks saying they refused to fight and defend the Berlin women. Local Nazi officials also sometimes pressurised parents, but many boys did not choose to fight. They were forced to do so. One example of this was Alfred Zesch. He was just 12 when he was thrust into the fighting. Now, he had actually been volunteered to fight in the war by his own family, and he was one of those who was decorated with the Iron Cross by Hitler in Berlin. He didn't even know that his father had been killed also in the fighting after he was pressed into the Volkssturm. He was then later sent a long way away from his home to modern-day Czech lands to fight, and despite being just 12, he was actually wounded and captured and then spent time as a prisoner of war. But the result of the child soldiers was truly tragic. Thousands of teenagers and some even younger, some still in school, died hopelessly in battles where their fate was absolutely doomed, and their operations were doomed to fail. In Berlin, children as young as 12 were sent into fierce fighting with those one-shot weapons, Panzerfausts, and most of them died without ever firing that single shot. The Soviet Red Army had no problems with shooting and taking out these child soldiers too. In their eyes, they were a product of the Nazi land, and were at the end of the day a very dangerous enemy who needed dealing with there and then. Some after capture were shown weeping and pleading for their lives, but inside of Berlin, hundreds of young children were killed in the tough fighting with the Soviets. This was not their conflict. Some encountered truly terrible ends, being blown up by artillery or being attacked by rounds from T-34s or heavy tanks. But the street-to-street fighting led to Soviet soldiers taking absolutely no prisoners and firing their rifles and submachine guns at just children who did pose a danger to them. These were some of the most battle-hardened soldiers, and they were ruthless, and age for them did not matter. One Soviet officer later recalled finding, in his words, a boy of perhaps 13, still wearing short trousers, lying beside a smashed Panzerfaust. He was just a child. The use of child soldiers throughout the final weeks of the Second World War was one final desperate roll of the dice for the Nazis. It was, however, completely foreseeable that these youngsters would face immediate death at the hands of the Soviet Red Army. But the Nazis were more than happy to thrust teenagers into the conflict to meet a certain death. It showed the complete devotion some had to the Reich, and as families volunteered their own children to take up arms and be sent thousands of miles away to face the Red Army, it also shows that families were more than happy to send their children to go and fight and a grave. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and if you did enjoy this video, stay tuned for more. Thanks again for giving your time up and watching.